In this week's Leeds Business Podcast, we speak to Richard Flint, the man who built SkyBet into one of the city's biggest tech companies. Richard explains how SkyBet's wrong decision to focus on interactive TV in the early days actually ended up making the move into mobile betting a speedier success, as well as the importance of integrating SkyBet's products into SkyTV and the multiple reasons why Sky plc eventually sold 80% of SkyBet. Richard also talks us through how you build company culture, as well as the various stages that a business owner has to go through and how to manage those changes. He also gives us his secret tip for those looking to source angel investment. To make sure you never miss an episode of the Leeds Business Podcast, sign up to our priority list at www.leedsbusinesspodcast.com. Everyone that signs up gets a free gift to help their business. So, let's get into the show. Okay, on today's Leeds Business Podcast, I have with me Richard Flint, who's best known for, in effect, growing Leeds' arguably biggest tech company that we've ever seen. Hi, Richard.
Hi, nice to be here.
Thank you. Thanks for coming on. I won't go through the whole bio because that's in the show notes below. But for our listeners, just give us a run through of your career, sort of from Flutter to the end of Sky.
So actually, I'll go back a tiny bit before Flutter. So I sort of came from quite an academic family, did well in studies. Studied in the US, came back. It was sort of dot-com boom times. I went to a consultancy, McKinsey, for a little while, and then didn't really know. This is my early 20s. Didn't really know what the sort of what my future was going to be, where I'd focus. Ended up working in a small startup in East London called Flutter. That was a person-to-person betting company launched around the same time as Betfair. So we would our model was people would offer bets up and individuals would take it from the other side, and we were going to change the world of betting. Didn't really happen, but we merged with Betfair that had a different but related model, and maybe we'll come back to the name Flutter in the future. But then went to work at Sky. It was the launch of interactive TV services. I was based in West London. And around the same time as that, Sky bought a small sports and a very small betting company. It was called the Sports Internet Group in early 2000, set up by Peter Wilkinson, who founded FreeServe, who's a sort of Harrogate tech person. So him and some of the other people like Jeremy Fenn and others that you might have heard of formed this sports and betting and data services. It included Opta as well. And they sold that to Sky for what seemed like a crazy amount of money in the dot-com boom times in 2001. Part of the value of that for Sky point of view was all the sort of club website deals that they had and data and streaming and potentially betting as well. I was sort of the guy at headquarters in Osterley down in West London that was managing the relationship with this thing that we bought up in Yorkshire. I enjoyed working with them, a good team. I enjoyed trips up to Harrogate. I'm from Essex and we're living in West London there, but I enjoyed my trips up to Harrogate where the business was based. But then I guess the balloon of the dot-com boom times popped a bit. We weren't hitting targets, and a lot of the other assets in that acquisition had been sold off or shut down. And I, after a couple of years, was sort of sent up to the north, or encouraged to go to the north. We had a 1-year-old then. I came to work for a great guy called Nick Rust, running, being the sort of his number two in this business up in Yorkshire that was primarily at that point a telephone betting business. And then he, we were missing target. He got offered another good job, and I was sort of handed this thing up in Harrogate to sort of, and I thought I'd run it, do my best on it for a couple of years, and then go back down to London where my family was, where my background was. But actually, turned out, we could get into the depths of this as we go on, but it turned out to be a brilliant experience over the next, sort of 15 years running that business. And we've stayed in Yorkshire since that point. So that's sort of a bit of a background and how I ended up in Yorkshire and, how I was privileged enough to have that job for all that time and grow SkyBet in first Harrogate and then Leeds.
Fantastic. Would you, I assume you'd consider Nick leaving and you getting the job as a major sliding doors moment in your career?
Yes, I think it was, and also, being even before that, being being prepared to move up, and persuading my wife and to come up to Yorkshire and take that job when we left a lot of friends behind, particularly with a young baby. I don't know if you've got kids, Phil, but when there's quite a sort of group of people you do NCT classes with and make good friends. And I had friends and family down there. So leaving all that behind to come up and work in Yorkshire was sort of the first sliding doors moment. And then Nick leaving and being given the job of running the business was definitely a second one.
Yeah, it's interesting actually. I remember you mentioned SIG in Harrogate. I think I went for a job interview up there once back in the day. And I do remember what you said about, at the time, the price that Sky paid. Everyone went, "Oh my God, that's ridiculous for this." It was loss making at the time, wasn't it? If I remember.
Yeah, it was. And it was a lot of big companies were doing similar things, particularly sort of media companies around that time. It was AOL and Time Warner and all, which came a bit later. All sorts of crazy, amounts that were spent. But as we'll come on to talk about, Sky got its money back and more eventually.
Sure. So how did you go about growing this loss making business? What was how did you attack it?
Sure. Well, so I joined when I joined Nick's team. There were sort of 7 or 8 people in his top team, and myself being the sort of the one from Sky coming up, and they were all from a sort of traditional betting industry background. And when he left, I took over, and if truth be told, I didn't really know how to go about it, and I didn't do a very good job for a couple of years, and I was lucky to be given a chance to improve over time. That's another sort of sliding doors moment. I'm an Arsenal fan, and sort of Mikel Arteta could have got fired after his first 3 games, and thank goodness he didn't. And that could have been my situation. So in the first few years, I really, I liked all my colleagues, but I thought, well, I've given this sort of chief executive job, what was managing director back then. We were part of Sky in this period, and we stayed that way for quite a long time. And I thought my job as sort of now the leader, and I thought of myself as a pretty clever bloke. My job was then to be in as many important meetings as I can and making as many important decisions as I could, and work with the team that I had and the culture I had, but just make the right decisions. And that wasn't a successful approach. People didn't really like me getting involved in all these things that were their jobs. They didn't really, they didn't sort of follow my lead on things, and that was, my fault really for not spending time getting people bought in. I was a sort of, I was a manager who was all over the details. There was no lead. I wasn't a leader, and I didn't change the team or the culture. And it was just the sort of sticking plaster approach where I'd try and make some different decisions, but the whole organisation wasn't changing on the back of that. So I had a tricky couple of years where the performance didn't improve. And then a combination of having a good mentor in Sky, a guy called David Rowe, who had founded EasyNet, and having a coach who's a guy, Nick Cowley, who's based in Harrogate, who I still see from time to time, being on a sort of Sky leadership thing, reading a lot of stuff, including Good to Great, which I thought was a very important book for me at the time. Through all of that process, I became much more focused on team first and foremost, and culture, and leadership, being a leader rather than tinkering around in individual decisions. And that started us on a path where we ended up, it ended up being a great success and a brilliant experience. But there was definitely, I definitely had a couple of years where I wasn't doing a good job, and there was a sort of a turning point after that. Well, not sort of one single moment, but a sort of process where I realised what the job of running something and changing something was all about.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's we can talk about the second half in a moment, but that was a sort of, the early years were a bit of a failure.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you raise a couple of interesting points there. What I'm doing now is I work as a business sounding board, which is sort of half mentor, half coach, and you've put a lot of importance on what they did for you. Do you think mentoring, coaching is something that we don't do enough of in sort of entrepreneurial Britain?
Yes, I think it certainly is. I think it can come in its different forms. You can have a person you've worked for who you learn from. You can have family member that you can learn from. You can have people outside of work that you can learn from. You can have someone like yourself or that I had that were sort of formal coaches. Or you can read books that sort of comes to the same thing to a degree. There's lots of ways you can get that, but like anyone, it's a different skill. Running. I had an academic background. I didn't have much management or leadership experience growing up, and I think it's a skill that you can learn. And some people are naturally better at it than others, but all of us can improve at it. And I definitely, felt that initially in the job, I sort of had, you're not really taught it, and so whatever you can find as a leader, a manager, to get those skills, I think it's really important. So yeah, it sounds like the work you're doing and other people do is really helpful. It was really helpful for me, and really helpful for any other young leader in particular, but also people entering leadership, whatever stage in their life.
I can definitely vouch for Good to Great. A coach of mine introduced me to it, and anybody that's listening, go out and read it. It's quite old now. It's 20, 30 years old, so some bits of it might seem outdated. But the coach that we worked with, we ended up with our BHAG on the meeting room wall at all times, so it was a guiding light for everything we did. Brilliant book, and I've read it numerous occasions, and I recommend it to everybody. So if you're listening, Jim Collins, Good to Great, definitely worth doing. So you've now developed from this fingers in lots of pies manager to a more of a stepping away manager from various reasons. How did that show itself in terms of the performance of the business?
Like all these sort of things, it's a sort of jagged road. There are many things that we tried that didn't work, and there were people that we hired that didn't work, but we've got enough right to start to improve the performance of the business. And sort of, as well as the individual things that we tried, like we launching a TV channel that was a sort of Keno game that was a lot, it's called Sky Vegas Live, to we launched our own poker solution, which is still working, but wasn't a huge success. To some of the other things we launched that went really well, like Super Six, which is still played by millions of people as a sort of prediction game on Soccer Saturday on a Saturday afternoon. So we tried a lot of things over the period, but we did enough right to start improving the performance. So having a good website in the early days was critically important, and then having a great mobile site was a real thing that we majored on and did really well on. Broadening out the range of products from just initially just telephone betting to launching casino games and bingo and poker online. Doing the channel shift that I talked about, but really the whole sort of bigger picture journey was one from a sort of old style betting company with people who came from a betting industry background that were very hierarchical, not very collaborative, not very tech focused, not very sort of marketing or product focused. What they were very good at is setting the right odds and managing the sort of higher spending customers closely and building good relationships with them. But that we had to really move away from that. That wasn't really Sky didn't buy the business to have telephone betting operation with 20 or so big customers. Sky bought the business really as it saw betting as something that could add to its sports offering, and obviously from a revenue point of view, but also from a sort of customer engagement point of view. It was pretty clear, as we're seeing in America now, that a lot of people bet on sports to make them more exciting and more enjoyable if they've not got an interest because their team's not playing, etc. and there are other people who will watch sport because they've got a bet on it. That they'll being more engaged with that, watch a golf game or something, or horse racing because they've got a bet on it, and they wouldn't otherwise do that. So the sort of the big picture vision for the company was one that was tied to the media business, tied to initially interactive TV, but then to the Sky websites, and we had to move the whole organisation away from old style telephone betting to new style product marketing, collaboration with other parts of Sky, and that was a big cultural change that we can talk about. We had to get different people, a different attitude, much more tech oriented, customer oriented, analytical. Tended to be younger, and that was a sort of 6 or 7 year journey from the mid 2005-6 to 2010, 11, 12, where we really started to build the right organisation, and then we got all that in place for the growth that we happened over that period, but then the subsequent acceleration in growth from that point.
So that was a proactive thing from you and your fellow directors and leaders to move from being a betting company to a tech company, or a tech/media company. That was the shift you had to go through.
Yes, I'd say that's right. And whilst I was probably the catalyst to do it, what I realised is you had to get, this is the thing in Good to Great, get the right people on the bus first of all. So it wasn't like I sort of, put my head in a cold towel and sat down and worked out this whole strategy. It was more directionally, I knew that was where we needed to go, and I recruited people that had the right attitude for that I could work with. Some of them had good relationships with Sky and the right experience on the technology side, and then together over time we moved the culture and moved the whole business from, like you said, a betting company to a tech company that happened to do betting.
Just going back to a couple of things you said, and this happens with everybody and everybody's businesses. Some of the business decisions don't go well and some go right, and it's sometimes the ones you think are bankers that are going to go right go wrong, and the other way around. What would you say was the biggest one that went wrong, and what did you learn from it?
I think that it's never quite sort of black and white or sort of right and wrong, but we initially focused on interactive TV. I don't know if you or many of the listeners, remember this, but Sky had a sort of thing where you could press the red button to buy a holiday. The internet was in its relatively early days there. So right back in the early, 2005-6, there was a sort of debate whether interactive TV would be a huge thing where people did their shopping and banking and betting and bought their holidays on TV, or whether whether PCs, laptops, and we didn't even think of the mobile phone back then, would be the way people would interact with this thing called the internet. And Sky had a bit of a bet on the former, and we fell in line with that. So we had initially a big focus on, the services that you would get when you're watching Sky Sports, you press the red button, you could place a bet on the football. And it, it actually did quite well in the early days. And almost that made it more of a challenge, because we started to sort of focus the business around that. And we launched various sort of pieces of content, so you could press the red button and you could hear a betting related commentary on the game. But as the 2000s went on, it was pretty clear that these services interactive TV wasn't going to be big enough. Betting was probably the thing that worked more than anything else, but it was clear that the functionality and the usability and the sort of privacy that you get from having a laptop would win. So we made some mistakes focusing on that, but the benefit of that was that a lot of our competitors had only ever moved from telephone betting to the internet, and for various sort of technical reasons I won't get into, actually having a website and an interactive TV service in the early days meant that we were able to move on to mobile, and as time went on, much quicker and easier and better. because we'd already done sort of more than one platform than our competitors. So actually, it didn't go right. It was a sort of strategic error, but what we learned from that helped us move to mobile much better than many of the other companies.
Okay. So it's in the end, it was a bit of a shortcut.
You could say that, yeah. That'd be a generous way of describing it as a shortcut.
All right. A very long shortcut.
But yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So we're in sort of the mid to late 2000s, and obviously online sports betting, casino, poker, bingo—they're all going bananas. And then Sky had their fingers in every pie. Was that again? Sometimes people who run businesses want to focus on one product. Sometimes they go multi-product. Again, what was the sort of decision behind that, and was it right or was it wrong?
Yeah, I don't think it was any great genius, and that all of anyone that knows the sort of industry, all sites have all the products there, and we found that that sometimes the industry gets some stick for that. People just want to come on, place bets on football, and you're trying to send them to a casino. There's some truth in that, but in reality, in the early days when we didn't have a casino, customers were saying, "I'm not going to place my sports bets with you because I actually want the ability to play both on one account." So it was, that sort of broadening out of the product range was an industry-wide thing for all the major operators, and it was customer led in part, and it was pretty inevitable that we would follow that. I don't think it was any great genius there. I think that the things that we did do well that were unique were focus on the relationship with Sky. So I mentioned the Super 6 free-to-play game that was a big driver, and we were able to sort of integrate odds into the Sky websites in a way that made sense to customers. And again, some people criticize gambling companies for that, but customers were crying out for it. Customers were saying, one of the big things in the Score Center was, in the Sky Sports Score Center, was saying we'd like to be able to see what the odds are and place bets directly from the Score Center. That's what customers were asking for. So we did all that sort of integration with Sky well. We eventually got the sort of brand right. And, there's always this challenge when you've got a big parent brand like Sky Sports. We were SkyBet. We didn't want to have our advertising looking like it was promoting the football, but we wanted to make it clear to customers that we were a sister company of Sky. So there's quite a lot of work in tone of voice and brand and using Sky imagery but whilst being slightly distinguishable from Sky. So we eventually got all of that right. We got our products quick and easy to use for the mass market. We were always more casual, small stakes, and sort of fun betting. We got products right for all of that. We got all the sort of basics of internet marketing, like pay-per-click and everything else right for that. All this we sort of learned over the 2000s by having the right people involved and having a sort of test and learn approach. And then sort of the big thing that we got ahead of the rest of the industry on, which I mentioned earlier on, was mobile. We were helped by the fact our technology was well set up to launch on mobile, but we also, we could see it coming. We could see that we could see from just being in touch with other internet businesses and seeing a bit what was going on at Sky. You could see how betting would translate really well to mobile, and we invested early in a good product that was had all the functionality that Apple could provide, and definitely that was a sort of big jump in our performance when mobile started to grow.
I assume that was driven because you owned your own product, your own tech, rather than white label as many of the other people did.
Thank you for mentioning that, because it's a good point. Yes, we partly because of that interactive TV shortcut or detour, however you want to describe it. We had a lot because none of the this is sort of quite specific, but quite a lot of the other betting companies outsourced a lot of their technology. But we couldn't do that because no one else developed for interactive TV because there wasn't really a market for it. So because we'd sort of set ourselves up to develop on interactive TV, we owned a lot of the tech and the front end ourselves, and we defined the APIs to the back end more clearly. and that meant we were able to move to mobile more quickly. Like you said, because we own the technology, we developed a lot of that in house, and that gave us a better user interface on mobile. That also, we were able to translate that to online, to the internet. And yeah, we were well set up for it because of our interactive TV experience, but we also saw it coming quite early and got ahead of the game on it.
Okay. Before we go into the next bit, which is selling the business or divesting the business of Sky, and that's another part of the story. I need to tell everybody about the Leeds Business Podcast Gentleman's Agreement and Ladies Agreement. So it's a two-sided agreement. My half of the agreement is every week I bring you inspiring Leeds business people, totally for free. Your half of the deal, Mr. and Mrs. Listener, has 3 simple steps. Number 1, I want you to share this podcast with just one person who you think will get value from it. Step 2, I want you to post a review of the show at either Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. And step 3, you need to give this episode a like. That's all. Fair deal. Okay. Richard, do you think everybody should give this episode a like and review it at either Apple Podcasts or Podchaser?
100%. As long as it's a positive review, yeah, 100%.
Right. Okay. So there you go. There's a caveat there. Richard says it has to be a positive review as well. Okay. So as I mentioned, so we've got Sky got brilliant mobile products. They've got lots of brands. They've got Sky Poker, Sky Bet, Sky Casino, and then it gets sold. Talk us through that process, because that must have been a completely new area for you.
Yeah. So we were doing well within the business within Sky, but a sort of thing that I think people will be surprised about that don't know the industry, the sports betting side of the industry, is actually quite volatile. There's this sort of perception that the bookies always win, and of course over time we do. But in all betting businesses, but particularly ours, we had a lot of people betting small stakes on accumulators across a number of football matches. So people would bet, on a typical weekend, they bet £5 or £10 on Manchester United to win, Barcelona to win, Real Madrid to win, Celtic and Rangers to win, Liverpool to win, back then maybe even Arsenal to win, and some other teams in the Championship. And that £5 bet would, once in every 20 weeks or something, that £5 bet would turn into £200 or £1,000. Obviously, the rest of the time it would lose and we would win. And people tended to bet, even though there were lots of individuals, they bet on the same things. And essentially, this meant that it was very volatile as a business and quite stressful as a person running the business. And Sky didn't really understand this, and it sort of freaked them out a bit because they used to steady subscription income. And they, the chief exec, Jeremy Darroch at the time, understandably didn't want to be, reporting to the city to say, we missed our target by 50 million or 20 million pounds because SkyBet had a few bad weekends. Because shareholders in Sky didn't really understand and weren't necessarily, closely connected with the betting business. So there was that volatility which was stressing everyone out and causing me to, have to occasionally have difficult phone calls with the chief exec of Sky at the time. Also, the sort of little things like the financial year. Sky's financial year ended at the 30th of June. So, and that would often be in a sort of summer tournament. That would be the time when we want to invest most in marketing. And again, we didn't want to Sky didn't want us affecting their annual results by spending a load of marketing at the end of the year when they were trying to hit a profit number. So there's all these sort of, we were up in Yorkshire, they were down in London. It became if I was to summarise it, we became too big to ignore, but too small to be in the scheme of Sky to be well understood. And around that time, also CVC, who owned us, had made an aborted attempt to buy Betfair, so they knew about the industry and they were keen to get involved. And also, what I didn't know at the time was that Sky UK were trying to buy Sky Italia and Sky Germany. So there's sort of 3 or 4 things going on, and I was probably getting a bit frustrated by this, too small to be understood and too big to be ignored, or whether it was the other way around. And those sort of things came together in around, when was it, sort of 2013, 2014. And eventually, I won't go into sort of the sort of negotiations, which took a long time, but eventually Sky opted to sell the business, or sell 80% of the business, keep 20%, and CVC, who are a well-known private equity company, most notably they'd had a successful investment in Formula One, bought the other 80%. And the next 3 years were actually really enjoyable and really successful. We were sold for £800 million. We were making sort of 50 or so million in EBITDA at that time, and we essentially sort of quadrupled it over the next 3 years. Really, but
Wow.
the strategy remained quite similar. The relationships with Sky were kept partly because the contract kept that relationship with Sky going. We also personally invested a lot in keeping that strong relationship with Sky, and they still had the 20%, so they were invested in it. The benefit that we had, though, is we sort of had freedom to invest more fully, particularly at the end of the financial year. CVC put quite a lot in the business as well, in terms of investment. The whole volatility question was taken away because CVC understood about that and didn't have the constraints of being a public company. But the team remained largely the same. We grew our culture, we grew our independence. It was really enjoyable and successful, and a great period for all of us, I think.
What learnings did you take from selling the business? That must have been the first time you'd been through the business sales process. What did you? I've been through it. You learn an enormous amount. It's highly stressful. What do you think you learned as a manager from going through a business sales process? And what would you recommend or pass on advice to somebody who maybe is considering selling their business?
I think maybe the first thing is it does take a lot of time and emotional effort. And I'm glad that we had a team in place that knew each other, and that the sort of engine was humming at that time. So we were able to, I was able to spend, myself and the CFO were able to spend quite a bit of time with the new acquirers, and we're confident that the wheels wouldn't fall off the business. So I think it's really, really important, and we were able to do that. We also, it's a sort of tricky time where your allegiances change a little bit, and we were part of Sky, and Sky didn't want us to have much engagement with the acquirers because perhaps they felt that we would sort of jump over to their side. But the people acquiring us needed to trust that we were the right people, or obviously there are situations where they think we're not the right people. But in our situation, I think everyone wanted, they didn't want to change the management, so we had to build a relationship with trust there. So there's a sort of, and there's a bit of a sort of pricing going on as well, where Sky wanted us to sort of say everything was rosy and be very optimistic about numbers, whereas CVC wanted to sort of know what the true picture was, and if anything, be able to argue that it was not going well, so they could argue for a lower price. So that sort of is all quite a tricky period. I mean, I think you have to, I don't know, it's sort of obvious and it feels a bit trite saying it, but I think you do have to build relationships with your new acquirer, despite the fact Sky didn't want us to do that. But you also have to be straight and respectful, and down the line with it, and not play too many clever games where conceivably we could have sort of got Sky to sell it for cheaper by making the numbers look worse or downplaying our prospects. But I think it's quite risky to do that because people will be Sky would have been very alive to that possibility, and I think if people start not trusting you on either side, then things can collapse pretty quickly. So I'd say straight bat, build the team so the machine is running efficiently, and play with a straight bat to all people throughout that process, and don't play any clever games, would be the two things I learned on that.
And then pretty soon after, was it 3, 4, 5 years later, you went through another acquisition / merger. Was that very different?
Yes, it was very different personally and emotionally because I wanted the business to be sold to private equity. Not, I made good money out of it, and many people did. We sort of distributed the shares very broadly. So, but coming out of Sky, it wasn't that I thought we'd make a load of money out of it. It was more that I felt it was what the business needed. When we were acquired by the Stars Group, I actually didn't. I didn't. It's not the outcome I wanted. I would rather have kept our independence by listing. We were sort of well down an IPO path, and that was my preferred route. And even we were going to be
Sorry, I was going to say you actually got a fair way down the line to IPO before Stars bought you.
Yes, we were 2 weeks away from IPOing. We'd had everything in place. And this is sort of classic private equity tactic of they certainly don't want to be in a position where there's only one buyer for something they're trying to sell. So essentially, we were down a sort of public route, but it was no huge surprise that a strategic buyer came in. But they weren't really the strategic buyer that I wanted. They were they had a lot of grey market business back then. They were active in. We were always very highly regulated, very compliance oriented. We became in the latter years very focused on sort of safer gambling and responsible gambling. The people that bought us were very international, had a grey market background, had some sort of dubious things in their recent past, and I won't go into too many of the sort of personalizing people involved, and there's always a sort of ego involvement as well. You go from running it to being somewhere down the hierarchy a bit. I didn't necessarily want that, so I tried to discourage the sale from happening, but it was pretty clear. I think CVC wanted the sale to happen, but because they got a very good return, and most of that was in cash. I thought that Sky wouldn't want the business and their brand to go to this to the Stars Group, but it turned that Sky were actually keen for the sale to happen as well. So I sort of lost that battle, and that was emotionally difficult because I felt my baby was going to a home that wasn't a suitable home, and that was difficult. But eventually I had to get on board with it. And when it was clear that I wasn't able to stop it, I had a choice of either digging in, and I probably would have been kicked out at that point, or supporting the transition to happen as best way I could, and that was the route I went down. It's turned out sort of the end of it was so Stars owned the business for a year or something, and then their share price went down quite a lot, partly because I think that the city realised that they weren't very good owners, and then what's Flutter called Flutter now, that was called Paddy Power Betfair then, had bought the whole Stars Group that included SkyBet, and I think now it is in a good home. And now, Flutter, which actually, maybe this sort of comes back to the early part of the story. So I'd originally joined Flutter in a startup in East London that merged with Betfair. Well, that business was renamed. The Flutter name was sort of warehoused, and the company was called Betfair. And then when Betfair bought Paddy Power, then the combined entity bought the Stars Group. It included SkyBet. They had to think what do we call the whole group rather than, it was called Paddy Power Betfair. They could call it Paddy Power Betfair Stars SkyBet, but obviously that would have been a stupid idea. And they looking for a sort of generic name to call it, and they realised they had this Flutter brand name and URL from 20 years ago, and they called the group Flutter. And I then joined the board of the combined group, having left for a sort of year in the meantime. And so I think it's a sort of reasonably happy ending.
Fantastic. That's a perfect circle, isn't it? Perfect circle.
Yeah, in some ways, yeah. That's good. It's good. Not many people know this actually, but it was a good personal situation. And now look, not everything's perfect. It's now it's not. I'm still very sort of proud of what SkyBet was. Now it's sort of a part of a bigger company, and inevitably you don't have quite the same entrepreneurialism and sort of identity that you have as a sort of independent company. But the whole group is doing really well, and now the US has opened up, and Flutter owns FanDuel, that are the leaders in the US. They're the leaders in Australia. They're the leaders in Italy, leaders in lots of the major markets. And, it's a proper company that takes a lot of the safer gambling side of things very seriously, and is focused on regulated markets, and is a grown-up business. So it's a good home for what was SkyBet.
Yeah, fantastic. So through that whole journey we've been through, what would you say you've learned that are the key areas business owners need to be successful or good at to be successful?
I mean, there are lots of different skills and different stages, and I do think that now I'm doing quite a bit of angel investing, and I think you do need different skills and different mentalities at different stages along that journey. In the early days, when you're a 20-person company, you do need to be in the detail. You do need to have a vision for what you're doing for your customers, and you actually, as an individual, need to force that to be the case and be involved in the marketing and being involved in the product. But then I think the one of the big skills as a business grows is to learn when to move away from that and when to focus on building a team and eventually building a culture, where you're not in every decision, and you've got people that do a better job at every single part of that business than you ever would. So it's about, I think, maybe the one big lesson is to, along that journey, to understand where you are and be flexible and change as you go. So I went from, in the early days, being too detail oriented, and I was definitely holding on to that for too long, to then building a good team, and then to working with, and then, there's a point at which we sort of had the analogy move from being a player, like using a football analogy, from being a player on the pitch to being a sort of player manager where you do a bit of both, to being a manager where you are actually, you're focused on putting your team in the right positions and making sure they pass the ball to each other. And then there's sort of a step after that where you're actually more of a sort of figurehead for the company, and actually the role is more
your director of football,
more outward focused. Yes, something like that. Yeah, and you actually sort of represent the culture in a different way, and you're almost like on show all the time. You're almost like, how you walk into the lift, or when you get. We sort of divided the company as we went. We started with, we got to 150 people, and then we subdivided into two, and then we further subdivided. And I think there's a sort of thing called the Dunbar number. I think it's in one of those books. Might not be good to great, where sort of 100, 150 people you can know everyone, but you get to sort of above that, and we eventually got to around 2,000. You can't know everyone, but you're almost like you're then the sort of, you're representing the culture, and almost like how you walk into a room, or whether you wash your cups of tea up afterwards, or whether you what you say in a sort of company annual meeting, or what emails you send to the company. You almost become like it's almost a politician type role. So on that sort of 20-year journey, as we grew from 80 people to 2,000, your role has to change along that. And I think being alive to where you are on that, and being willing to change, and being willing to sort of get guidance from people around you as to where you are and where you should be, I think is almost my biggest lesson along the whole journey.
Yeah, I mean, people often say what got you here won't get you there, and I think that's sort of what you're talking about.
Yeah,
you mentioned a word there 2 or 3 times, the word culture, and every week on the Leeds Business Podcast we do a how-to session, and I know you're going to do us a quick 5 minutes, a how-to on how to build company culture. So take it away.
Sure. This might not be very slick, but it's, essentially, I think the most important thing that we did was build a great culture. And I think most people that worked at SkyBet in the sort of from around the sort of 2012 to 2018 would say we had a great culture. And thinking back to how we did that, I think the first thing to do is to realize that you can't do that. You can't change a culture yourself. I think, we needed to change some of the people, bring some new people in, and bring allies in that share that mentality. So, I think and this is in good to great. Get the right people on the bus first of all. And I 100%. I think that's right. Then I think it's a we had to. There's quite a few sort of in any organization. There's a few sort of sacred cows almost or sort of physical symbols that can represent a culture, and you can, by changing those, you can really change a culture. So we it used to be, we had a sort of goldfish bowl where all the traders would face one way towards these big TV screens, and moving offices and getting everyone away from that situation where they could almost, the traders were never sort of bothered by the rest of the business, was a big cultural statement, and forcing them to sort of mix with the rest of the business and sit on in open plan offices with everyone else was a big cultural statement. But there are probably 10 or so other. We used to have named car parking spaces for some of the senior team. Getting rid of that was important. Structuring the office where we had a sort of big central area where people would meet and talk, and we would do company town halls. That was a sort of big statement. But there's dozens of these things that we did. So picking those sort of symbols that can be physical to sort of emphasize the change in culture is part of it. Going through all the sort of agreeing a set of company values together, working out together what's with your top team, what the culture you want is a big part of it. Rewarding people who emphasize the culture is a big part of it. Moving people on, despite the fact they might be strong performers who don't reflect the culture you want, is a big part of it. So I think that there are many things that we did along the way, and some of these are in good to great. But I think to build a great culture, you have to be really conscious that you're doing it, and it doesn't happen accidentally. It was almost our top priority to work on what culture we want, how we're going to change it, what signifies it, what doesn't signify it, and get the right people to do that, and manage it very closely towards where you want to be over, probably takes you 5 years, was I think how we did it. And I think that is, that's, in my experience, the way to do it.
Okay. So building culture is something you proactively have to say, this is what we want the culture to look like, actually do stuff that says that, but also keep quite on top of it as well. And say, well, that's not within culture,
Yes.
or people aren't within culture, off they go. So it's the classic brilliant jerk, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, I know what you mean by that. I'm not sure, but you mean getting rid of the brilliant jokes rather than
yes, not keeping them. No,
yeah.
Obviously.
Yeah. Be consciously. I think the way to build a culture: get the right people, pick some symbols to focus on, consciously manage it, reward people who stick to the culture, move people on who don't stick to the culture, and don't underestimate the time and effort involved in it, and constantly look for feedback on it, and get everyone bought into the direction you're going in. And I think having good, for me, I had a really good top team that we spent a lot of time getting to know each other and building trust in that top team. And there weren't many politics, much politics after that, because people knew that the top team were tight, and would have we'd disagree on things and have strong conversations, but underlying it all, we were all going in the same direction and trusted each other. And I think that filtered down the organisation, which was another thing that helped us with that strong culture. Yeah.
I'm conscious we're running quite long on time, but I just want to touch on your angel investment activity. You've got 8, 9, 10 angel investments, I think it is on your LinkedIn I looked at. What would you recommend to a startup company that's looking for angel investment? What should they be doing? What they should be looking for? How do they best present themselves to somebody like you or I that invests in startups?
It's funny. The ones I've ended up investing in have been often quite sort of, a bit random, to be truthful. Things people I've met, or ideas that I've sort of cottoned onto. I think if you can do it, I think building informal connections with potential angel investors is a good way to do it. Just reaching out for advice or getting to know through a sort of trusted third party. The ones that are going the best, certainly that are a certain size, are Butternut Box and Seat Unique, which I've invested more in both, and I'm chair of both of them. They came about through friends of friends, and I think with both of them, I got a very strong feeling about the people involved quite early on, and that was why I invested. So I think there's a sort of analogy there. If you can, if you can get angel investors who outside of a sort of formal pitch process, and who you can communicate your passion, your values, your product market fit outside of a formal process, I think you've got a much better chance.
Okay, so are you saying you almost like your first port of call is the person rather than the product or the market?
Yes,
or whatever it is? Okay.
Yeah, I'm saying it's sort of all three really. But if the most important thing of them is the person, because everyone knows that a startup might have to pivot a few times along the way. I think the most important thing for me as investor is you invest in the people running it, and that you sort of have to have a sense that it's got a chance of success, but the person is what comes first. And so the more you can sort of, if you're looking for investment, the more you can build a personal connection with your potential investors, the better chance you've got. I mean, that is the danger in that from a sort of societal, maybe a sort of Leeds city point of view is, that means that people that perhaps come from different backgrounds and don't have those networks will struggle to get investment. And I think that, that's something we need to think about as a city and as a society. But if I'm looking for investment, my best chance is if I get to know angel investors outside of a formal pitch process.
Okay. Good advice. And then finally, this is the Leeds Business Podcast, and we invite every guest to give a plug to any Leeds startup business. So take it away. I suspect it's going to be one of your investments.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. So I'm going to pick on Ride. So it's RYDE. So maybe it's just sort of reinforcing some of the points I made earlier. So it's a spin studio, sort of indoor cycling studio, and we also do other classes as well, but focused on indoor cycling. Very lively, energetic, almost like a nightclub type vibe. Based in Leeds city centre, but we're rolling out in Manchester as well. But I got to know the business sort of like many of my investments, two things came together at once. So Kyle, who founded the business, used to run the gym next to SkyBet, so I knew him personally. I knew he had some relevant experience, had made some mistakes and learned from them, but I knew he was determined and could build a business and build a team. I also knew that he'd had a sort of small spin studio within the gym that was next to SkyBet that had done well. But over the sort of, just before the pandemic, I was traveling down a lot to London, and I can't run because my knees are not great. I used to look for exercise to do in the middle of London. I used to sort of sign up to these spin classes that were all they were much. I was a bit of fish out of the water. They're much sort of trendier than I was, but I could get some exercise there. But I was noticing that they would sell out. They would go on sale, and then literally they would sell out within. They'd go on sale a week before the class, and they would sell out in the day. And these were like 40 bike studios with charging 25 quid a bike. They were doing 10 classes an hour. 10 classes a day. You just do the maths, and it's an incredible business. And so the combination of knowing Kyle, seeing the business opportunity, I backed Kyle to do it. Then, of course, we went straight into a pandemic, so we had to shut down. We couldn't open, but eventually got going in Leeds, and people love it. Some of the, I think part of the thing on the pandemic, people have missed group exercise, missed getting to know communities of people. There's much more sort of health and fitness orientation amongst the younger people today than there was when I was that age. And some of the sort of the reviews, I guess, and the emails he gets about how much people enjoy the class and how much they get out of it and how it's important for their mental health. They're quite moving. And they've built a great community there, going really well. A lot of sort of people who are professional, a lot of, people like listen to this podcast, I'd imagine, part of the Leeds business community are going there, going really well, and I'm sure that we'll do well in Manchester as well. And then after Manchester, I wouldn't say the rest of the world, but it's probably, in places like London, it's quite competitive, but there are many places that are not well served by this. So we'll probably look for the underserved areas of the country and the world rather than taking on in the big cities. Okay.
Fantastic. There will be links to everything to do with Ride will be in the show notes below. And anything else you want to add, Richard? Anything we haven't covered? I know we talked for a long time. Anything you'd like to say?
The only last thing to say is, I know this is a Leeds business podcast, and I do think Leeds is a great place to grow a business. It's sort of a city that you can get your arms around. There's a great there's a great load of tech talent there in the city. It's good transport links to London. You can live in it. You can live in a great place with the outdoors really close. Yes, we could probably do with some better transport links across the north and maybe in the city itself, which I know is something that people like Tracy Braben are focused on. But overall, I think Leeds is a fantastic city, and it was a real privilege to grow a business in Leeds and to carry on being involved in the area.
That's great. And on that note, thank you very much, Richard.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode. I hope you found it both interesting and of use. To make sure you don't miss any future episodes, please subscribe to the show. Go on, do it now. Do it now before you go off and do something else. Much appreciated. Oh, and don't forget our gentleman's agreement. See you next week.